September 19, 1944. Lorraine, France. Dawn. The world was still half asleep when the 113th Panzer Brigade began to roll forward. The air was thick with fog, so heavy that even the hulking silhouettes of German Panthers looked like ghosts moving through a white abyss. Inside their steel monsters, German crews felt confident. These were Panthers, the pride of Hitler's armored force, the tank that had humbled Allied Shermans again and again. To them, this was routine. Another morning, another attack. But then, something broke the silence. A sound the Germans had never heard before. Not the deep, guttural roar of a Maybach engine. Not the familiar growl of Allied Shermans. This was different. A high-pitched whine, like an aircraft skimming just above the earth. The Panthers halted. The gunners squinted through the fog. And suddenly, shadows appeared. Low, sleek shapes darting out of the mist, no higher than a man's chest, moving at speeds no tracked vehicle should ever reach. In seconds, flashes erupted, muzzle fire, shells screaming through the fog. 3 Panthers exploded almost instantly. Another was crippled before its gunner could even bring the barrel around. German crews frantically tried to swing their turrets, but it was hopeless. By the time their crosshairs lined up, the attackers were already gone. The whole encounter lasted less than 20 seconds. The Germans sat in stunned silence. What had just hit them? These were no Shermans. These were no ordinary tank destroyers. They had just met America's most radical armored weapon, the M18 Hellcat. A machine so fast, so agile, that it could humiliate Germany's best tanks before they even had a chance to fire back. And in that foggy battlefield of Lorraine, the myth of German armored invincibility began to crack. For years, German tank crews had been trained to expect certain things from their enemies. Shermans. Too slow. Too undergunned. Easy prey once the big cats, Panthers and Tigers, lined them up in their sights. British Churchills. Clumsy beasts, lumbering forward like steel dinosaurs. German doctrine was clear: tank destroyers, if the enemy built them, would be slow-moving fortresses, much like their own Jag Panthers and Elephant tank destroyers. Heavily armored, heavily armed, but predictable. So when the M18 Hellcat appeared, it wasn't just a new vehicle. It was a shock to the system. Imagine sitting inside a 45-ton Panther, its massive turret grinding slowly to the side. At best, a Panther's turret could spin in 19 seconds, if the engine was revving high. More often, it took a full minute to traverse completely. Now imagine an American Hellcat tearing across the battlefield at 55 miles per hour, covering 400 meters in just 16 seconds, faster than your turret could even rotate. That was the nightmare German tankers faced. By the time they saw the Hellcat, by the time their brain registered what it was, by the time their turret began to swing, boom. The Hellcat was already gone, repositioned, and firing from a different angle. Speed was its armor. Agility was its shield. Mobility was its weapon. And to the Germans, it made no sense. How could a tank destroyer sacrifice armor? How could the Americans dare to send men into battle inside something so thin-skinned? To them, it looked suicidal. But to the Americans, it was genius. Because the Hellcat flipped the rules of tank warfare upside down. It wasn't about who had the thickest armor. It wasn't about who had the biggest gun. It was about who could control the fight, who could move first, shoot first, vanish first. The math was cruel to the Germans. A Tiger tank's mighty 88mm cannon meant nothing if it couldn't line up a shot in time. A Panther's carefully engineered optics meant nothing if the target was already gone. For the first time, German crews felt something they rarely experienced in armored combat. They were being hunted. The hunter had become the prey. And this shock, this psychological blow, was almost as devastating as the shells that ripped into their tanks. The Hellcat didn't appear by accident. It was born from a radical idea, one that went against everything the U.S. Army had believed about tanks up until that point. December 1941. Washington, D.C. Inside a dimly lit War Department conference room, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Davis Bruce stood before a table of skeptical generals. Just weeks earlier, the world had watched in horror as Hitler's armored divisions crushed Europe with terrifying speed. Poland had fallen in 35 days. France, once considered the world's greatest land power, collapsed in 6 weeks. Conventional military wisdom had been shattered. Heavy fortifications, static defenses, slow-moving armies, all had proven useless against German blitzkrieg. Bruce, a cavalryman by training, understood something the old guard did not. Mobility was the new king of the battlefield. And he proposed something unthinkable. Instead of trying to match the German Panzers with equally heavy tanks, America should build a new kind of weapon. Not a fortress on tracks, but a predator. Not a tank that withstood blows, but a tank that avoided them. His vision was simple but radical. A machine that would hunt tanks the way cavalry once hunted infantry. Fast. Silent. Striking where the enemy least expected. Then vanishing before they could react. The motto he gave to this force would become legendary. Seek. Strike. Destroy. At first, even within the U.S. Army, his ideas sounded insane. A vehicle with thin armor. A vehicle that relied on speed instead of protection. Many senior officers scoffed. They believed American soldiers would be slaughtered. But then came the evidence. German blitzkrieg had shown that speed itself could be a weapon, sometimes more devastating than guns or armor. The Ordnance Department began experimenting. The early requirements in late 1941 called for a fast vehicle armed with just a 37mm gun. That quickly proved inadequate. The spec was upgraded, first to 57mm, then 75mm, and finally to a 76mm high-velocity gun. The question was, could such firepower be mounted on something light enough to fly across a battlefield? By 1943, the Buick Motor Division had the answer. Their prototype, the T-70, demonstrated speeds no one thought possible for a tracked vehicle. Test drivers pushed it beyond 50 miles per hour on level ground. Engineers laughed in disbelief. Soldiers who rode in it compared the engine's high-pitched whine to an aircraft. German intelligence, when they caught wind of this project, dismissed it immediately. Typical American naivete, they said. To them, a 17-ton tank destroyer with armor no thicker than 25mm was absurd. Against a Panther's 46 tons or a Tiger's 57 tons, it would be suicide. They couldn't have been more wrong. What the Germans failed to grasp was that America's vast automotive industry, Buick, General Motors, Ford, knew something about design the German war machine did not. The US wasn't trying to build the biggest tank. They were trying to build the smartest a machine that embodied a new philosophy, that speed could be armor, that mobility could be survival, that agility could be lethality, and so, the M18 Hellcat was born, thin as paper. Light as a truck. But with an engine that could roar at 55 miles per hour and a turret that could spin faster than anything the Germans had ever seen. That IT wasn't just a tank destroyer. It was a revolution. Summer 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy were thick with smoke. The thunder of artillery rolled endlessly across the fields of northern France. German commanders, still confident in the armor of their panzer divisions, believed they could stall the Allied breakout with Tigers and Panthers alone. They were about to meet something entirely new. For weeks, American Hellcat crews had trained in secrecy. They knew their machine was faster than anything on the battlefield, but they hadn't yet proven it under fire. That moment came in late July, during Operation Cobra, the Allied push to break out of the Bocage country and race across France. Picture it. A German Panther sits hidden in a French orchard. Its crew listens to the distant rumble of Sherman engines. They know the Americans are coming. They are ready. The Panther's 75mm high-velocity gun can kill any Allied tank at over a mile. Then, out of the morning mist, a sound unlike any they had heard before. Not the deep growl of a Sherman. Not the grinding crawl of a Churchill. But a piercing, high-pitched whine, like an aircraft engine screaming across the fields. Before the Panthers gunner can even shout a warning, an American Hellcat bursts from cover, racing at nearly 50 miles per hour down a farm track. Its turret spins in a blur, the 76mm gun locking on target in seconds. One shot. The Panther erupts in flames. The German crew never had a chance. For the first time, the battlefield dynamic had flipped. German tanks, long accustomed to hunting at their leisure, were now being stalked themselves. Word spread quickly among American troops. The Hellcat wasn't just another tank destroyer. It was something entirely different. Its speed allowed it to ambush, relocate, and strike again before German gunners could even traverse their massive turrets. At Aricourt in September 1944, the Hellcats proved their worth beyond all doubt. The U.S. 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M18s, faced waves of German armor, including Panthers and Panzer IVs. Outnumbered, the Americans used speed, maneuver, and cunning to devastating effect. Hellcats darted through fog and smoke, circling German tanks like wolves. Panthers fired blindly into the mist, unable to keep pace. In just a few days of combat, the Americans destroyed more than 86 German tanks, often at ranges the enemy thought impossible. A stunned German prisoner later admitted, "We thought we were hunting them, but it was they who were hunting us." The effect on morale was electric. American crews felt invincible in their new machines. German tankers, once certain of their superiority, began to fear the piercing whine of the Hellcat's engine echoing across the battlefield. The message was clear: the days of German dominance in armored warfare were ending. The M18 Hellcat had arrived, and it was rewriting the rules. By autumn 1944, the M18 Hellcat was no longer a secret. German commanders had seen it, heard it, and, too often, suffered from it. But knowing about the Hellcat was one thing, stopping it was another. Unlike a Tiger or a Panther, which relied on armor to survive, the Hellcat relied on something far more elusive: movement. Hellcat crews understood a simple truth: if they ever fought head-on, standing still, they were dead. One well-placed German shell would rip through their thin armor like paper. But if they kept moving, if they danced around the battlefield faster than the enemy could react, they became untouchable. It wasn't brute strength. It was a deadly kind of ballet. Crews perfected a tactic they called shoot and scoot. Race into position at top speed, fire around, and then disappear before the enemy could return fire. Sometimes they circled around entire villages, hitting German tanks from one side, vanishing, and reappearing on the other. Imagine being inside a Tiger tank, 70 tons of steel, thick armor, and the most feared gun of the war. Now imagine trying to line up your shot while a Hellcat darted across open ground at 50 miles per hour. You couldn't. By the time your turret inched toward the target, the Hellcat was gone. To the Germans, it was infuriating. To the Americans, it was exhilarating. In training, Hellcat crews had even learned to use their speed against anti-tank guns. Instead of hiding from them, they rushed straight at them, zigzagging, moving so fast the gunners couldn't keep up. Before the German crew could reload, the Hellcat was on top of them, blasting them apart. It was insane. It was reckless. It was brilliant. At Aricourt, this style of fighting turned the tide. Entire German armored columns were thrown into chaos as Hellcats sliced through them like wolves scattering a herd. American tank destroyers didn't just kill tanks, they shattered German confidence. One captured German officer later admitted, "These vehicles moved so quickly, we thought we were facing aircraft on the ground." The psychological effect was devastating. The myth of German invincibility, built on Tigers and Panthers, was crumbling. And the Hellcat's whine, that high-pitched scream of its engine, became a sound every German tanker dreaded. But the Hellcat wasn't invincible. Its very strength, its speed, was also its greatest risk. Crews knew that one mistake, one wrong move, one hit they didn't dodge, and their thin armor would offer no protection. They lived on the edge every single battle. Still, they embraced it. Because they weren't just driving a tank destroyer. They were riding the fastest armored killer of World War II. And they were changing the way wars would be fought forever. Behind every Hellcat, behind the roar of its engine and the thunder of its gun, there were 5 men. 5 ordinary young Americans, most barely out of high school, thrown into a machine that demanded everything from them. The crew was tight-knit, almost like a family. The commander, often the oldest and most experienced, who carried the weight of life and death decisions. The gunner, whose steady hands and calm nerves meant the difference between survival and destruction. The loader, working furiously in the cramped space, feeding shell after shell into the breach. The driver, eyes glued to the terrain, knowing that every second of hesitation could mean a German round slamming into their thin armor. And the assistant driver/radio operator, keeping them connected to the larger fight, relaying orders, watching their flanks. They lived inside a box of steel no thicker than an inch. No insulation. No real protection. Every bump on the battlefield rattled through their bones. The roar of the radial engine deafened them. The stench of fuel, sweat, and gunpowder clung to their uniforms. When the Hellcat was in motion, the crew felt invincible, almost like they were flying low to the ground. The rush of speed, the power of their 76mm gun, the thrill of outmaneuvering German tanks, it was intoxicating. But when the Hellcat stopped, reality came crashing back. They knew one well-aimed hit would turn their vehicle into a burning coffin. There was no margin for error. Veterans later recalled the constant tension inside the crew. Every mission felt like a gamble. The moment the engine started, every man knew it might be the last sound he ever heard. Yet that fear also bonded them. Crews trusted each other with their lives in a way few civilians could ever understand. A driver might risk everything to save his commander. A loader might jam a shell in with bleeding hands just to give the gunner one more shot. And at night, when the engine was quiet and the battlefield silent, they laughed together. They wrote letters home. They shared rations. Some even said the Hellcat's thin armor forced them closer, not just physically in the cramped space, but emotionally, as brothers in arms. One veteran described it perfectly. We weren't just fighting in a tank destroyer. We were fighting in a death trap that only worked if we trusted each other completely. This was the true heart of the Hellcat, not its speed, not its firepower, but the young men inside it. Men who faced impossible odds, yet somehow found the courage to climb back in, day after day, and drive straight into danger. Because in the end, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about defeating an enemy who thought they could never be beaten. And in the hands of these young crews, the Hellcat became exactly what it was designed to be. Not just a tank destroyer, but a symbol of daring, ingenuity, and American willpower. For German tank crews, the battlefield was their hunting ground. They were used to stalking lumbering Shermans, outgunning British Churchills, and holding the upper hand in armored duels. Their Tigers and Panthers were the apex predators of Europe. But then, something new appeared. It wasn't heavily armored. It wasn't massive like a Tiger. In fact, at first glance, the Hellcat looked almost fragile. German crews mocked it as a cardboard tank. That arrogance wouldn't last long. The first time they encountered a Hellcat, many German crews didn't even see it until it was too late. Moving at 50 miles per hour across fields, darting in and out of cover, the Hellcat was a blur. The German tanks, slow, heavy, and cumbersome, couldn't keep up. Veteran Otto Carius, one of the most famous Tiger commanders, admitted that fast American and British vehicles frustrated German tactics. They relied on carefully planned ambushes, but speed destroyed that advantage. By the time a Tiger swung its massive gun into place, the Hellcat had already fired and vanished. The Hellcat's 76mm gun could punch through German Panthers at close range and cripple Tigers if it struck their weaker side armor. But it wasn't just the weapon that terrified German crews, it was the way Hellcats fought. German soldiers described it like being attacked by ghosts. They would hear engines in the distance, catch a glimpse of dust rising, and then, bang, an armor-piercing shell ripped into their flank. Before they could react, the Hellcat was gone. One Panther commander reportedly told interrogators after capture, "Your Hellcats fought like wolves. They never attacked us head-on. Always from the sides, always faster than we could respond. We hated them more than the Shermans." Even German infantry feared Hellcats. Unlike lumbering tanks, they could appear suddenly in villages, spraying machine gun fire, then dart away before Panzerfaust teams could line up a shot. To the Germans, fighting Hellcats was maddening. They were forced to waste valuable ammunition on a target that rarely stayed still. And when they finally did score a hit, they realized something chilling: there were always more Hellcats nearby. American production ensured that for every Hellcat knocked out, another rolled forward. German crews, stretched thin and short on fuel, simply couldn't keep pace. In the end, what unnerved German tankers most wasn't just the Hellcat's speed. It was the realization that America had figured out something they hadn't. Mobility and coordination beat heavy armor. Every time a Hellcat darted across the battlefield, it was another reminder that the Reich's days of tank superiority were numbered. The M18 Hellcat didn't just exist on paper, it earned its reputation on the battlefield. Let's step into some of its most legendary encounters, the moments that made German tankers fear its very name. The Battle of Aricourt, September 1944. Eastern France. Thick morning fog. German Panthers of the 113th Panzer Brigade were advancing, confident they would smash through the Americans. Then, out of the mist, came the banshee howl of Hellcat engines. Low silhouettes darted between the hedgerows, firing, disappearing, then reappearing somewhere else entirely. Lieutenant Edwin Leeper's platoon struck first. Within just 30 minutes, his Hellcats destroyed 15 Panthers. But the true legend was Sergeant Henry Hartmann. From a single flanking position, his gunner knocked out 6 Panthers in rapid succession. Each time they fired, they immediately repositioned. German gunners couldn't even traverse their turrets fast enough to catch them. By the time the fog lifted, 39 German tanks lay smoking in the fields. Aricourt wasn't just a victory. It was a massacre, proof that Hellcats could dismantle even elite panzer units. The Ardennes, December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge. Germany's last desperate gamble. Fog and snow blanketed the forests of Belgium. At the crossroads of Neuville, a handful of Hellcats faced the 2nd Panzer Division, a force that outnumbered them many times over. But instead of waiting to be crushed, the Hellcats turned the fog into their ally. They darted in and out, firing 2 or 3 rounds, then vanishing at full throttle before German guns could even line up. To the Germans, it felt like they were fighting an entire battalion. In reality, there were just 4 Hellcats. When the smoke cleared, 24 German tanks had been knocked out. The price? 1 Hellcat, lost to artillery. That single stand delayed the Panzer advance for 2 full days, time that allowed American reinforcements to dig in at Bastogne. Without the Hellcats at Neuville, the story of the Ardennes might have ended very differently. Italy, 1944. Many thought the steep mountains and narrow roads of Italy would cripple the Hellcats' speed advantage. They were wrong. During the Gothic Line battles, Hellcats would race up mountain roads, fire down into German positions in the valleys, then vanish before artillery could return fire. German reports bitterly complained that American tank destroyers were impossible to pin down and seemed to appear wherever pressure was greatest. In one engagement, Hellcats relocated so quickly between ridges that German commanders believed they were fighting multiple battalions. In reality, it was just one. The Pacific, 1945. Even in the jungles of the Philippines, the Hellcat proved adaptable. There weren't many Japanese tanks to hunt, but its speed made it invaluable. It became a bunker buster, dashing in close, blasting Japanese fortifications, then pulling back before infantry could swarm it. Crews even welded chicken wire and makeshift covers over the open turret to stop grenades from being tossed in. It wasn't glamorous, but it saved lives, and once again, the Hellcat proved it could adapt to any theater of war. Wherever it fought, France, Belgium, Italy, or the Pacific, the story was always the same. The Hellcat was there first. It struck hard. It disappeared. And it left German crews reeling. The Hellcat wasn't just a tank destroyer, it was a legend written in speed and firepower. Inside the beast, what made the Hellcat so fast? The M18 Hellcat's battlefield performance seemed almost supernatural to German tankers. How could a tracked vehicle move faster than some cars? How could it whip across the battlefield at 55 miles per hour when their Panthers could barely manage half that? The answer lay under the hood, and in every design decision that sacrificed bulk for blistering speed. Wrench the engine, an aircraft heart in a ground beast. At the core of the Hellcat was the Wright R975C4 radial engine, a 9-cylinder, air-cooled aircraft engine originally designed for planes. 400 horsepower packed into just 17.7 tons gave it an extraordinary 22.6 horsepower per ton power-to-weight ratio. By comparison, the Panther sat at 15.6 horsepower per ton, while the Tiger II dragged itself forward at a pathetic 8.8 horsepower per ton. The Hellcat's engine didn't just give it speed, it gave it acceleration. From 0 to 30 miles per hour in just 11 seconds, faster than many trucks of the era. German crews often reported Hellcats as disappearing before we could react. That wasn't an exaggeration, it was physics. Wrench transmission, automatic power on the move. While German tanks relied on clutch-heavy manual gearboxes that broke down constantly, the Hellcat came with the Torquematic automatic transmission. 3 forward speeds, self-shifting. No need for constant clutching or gear grinding. Allowed the driver to focus entirely on maneuvering at high speed. It was like comparing a race car to a tractor. German drivers wrestled their gearboxes. Hellcat drivers just floored it and steered. Wrench suspension, built for high-speed terrain. The Hellcat used torsion bar suspension, giving it 14 inches of will travel. That meant it could maintain speed across rough terrain where other tanks slowed to a crawl. The long suspension travel absorbed shocks that would have rattled a Panther apart. In training, Hellcat drivers learned to push the suspension to its limits, sliding around corners, cresting hills, even jumping small embankments. It wasn't just fast. It was nimble. Wrench the turret, speed in every direction. German tanks depended on engine RPM to power their turret traverse. At idle, a Panther might take 60 seconds to complete a rotation. Even at high revs, it was rarely under 20 seconds. The Hellcat? A hydraulic turret system spun 360 degrees in just 24 seconds, and it did so independently of engine speed. This meant a Hellcat could track a target at full speed, fire, and instantly swing the gun onto the next target while still moving. Panthers and Tigers simply couldn't keep up. Armor, or the lack of it. Of course, there was a price. The Hellcat's maximum armor was 25 mm on the turret front and as little as 13 mm on the hull side, stuff that's thinner than some German half-tracks. It could be penetrated by almost any German weapon, even heavy machine guns if they caught the sides, but this was deliberate. Every ton saved in armor was another mile per hour gained in speed. The philosophy was clear: don't get hit. Move so fast that the enemy never gets a clean shot. Open-top turret, a double-edged sword. The turret was open to the sky. This made it easier to build, lighter, and gave the crew excellent visibility, but it also left them vulnerable to grenades, artillery fragments, and even strafing aircraft. Many crews improvised covers, chicken wire, steel plates, tarps, to protect themselves. Still, the trade-off was worth it. The visibility allowed Hellcat commanders to spot targets faster and coordinate rapid maneuvers, turning danger into advantage. The Hellcat wasn't a mistake or an accident. Every bolt, every weld, every choice screamed one philosophy: speed is life. It was an anti-tank predator designed to outthink, outmaneuver, and outrun its prey. And when paired with well-trained American crews, it became one of the deadliest machines of the war. The legacy of the Hellcat, speed as the ultimate weapon. When the dust settled over Europe in 1945, the M18 Hellcat had written a story unlike any other armored vehicle of World War II. It didn't have the heaviest gun. It didn't have the thickest armor. But it had something no German tank could match: raw speed, combined with American tactical creativity, redefining armored warfare. The Hellcat proved that you didn't need to outbuild the enemy in brute force. You could outthink them. German doctrine worshipped armor thickness and gun size. American doctrine with the M18 flipped the script: mobility as armor, speed as survival, agility as lethality. It wasn't about winning a slugging match. It was about rewriting the rules so the slugging match never happened. Fire a predator in the fog. To German tankers, the Hellcat was a ghost. They'd spot a muzzle flash, and before their turret could traverse, the M18 was gone. They'd line up a perfect shot, only to find the Hellcat had already relocated 300 yards away. They'd hear that high-pitched aircraft-like whine and feel a chill. Panthers and Tigers weren't hunters anymore. Against the Hellcat, they were the hunted. Lessons that outlived the war. The tank destroyer doctrine itself was dissolved in 1945. But the Hellcat's influence? It never died. The Soviets built the PT-76 and later the BMP series, prioritizing mobility over armor. The British CVR-T family and the French AMX-13 carried the same DNA. Even modern vehicles like the US Stryker MGS and Italy's Centauro trace their lineage back to the Hellcat's philosophy: strike fast, disappear faster. And in today's warfare, where drones and precision weapons punish anything that sits still too long, the Hellcat's lesson is more relevant than ever: survival belongs to the fast and adaptable. The human legacy. But beyond the machines, there were the men. Young American crews who climbed into what they called tin cans on tracks, knowing one hit could end them. They weren't armored knights, they were daredevils, risk-takers, gamblers with steel nerves. They lived by 3 rules: shoot fast, move fast, think fast. Many survived not because of armor, but because their speed gave them a chance to escape when others couldn't. As one veteran said, it wasn't about fighting fair. It was about fighting smart. The Hellcat let us do that. The final word. The M18 Hellcat wasn't just a tank destroyer. It was a paradigm shift. It proved that the battlefield doesn't always belong to the strongest, or the heaviest, or the most powerful. Sometimes, it belongs to the fastest, the most daring, the most unpredictable. German tankers never imagined a tracked vehicle could reach 55 miles per hour. By the time they realized it, they were already watching their Panthers burn. And in that moment, the war wasn't just being fought with guns and armor, it was being fought with ideas. The Hellcat was more than a machine. It was American audacity on tracks, a symbol that speed, ingenuity, and boldness could rewrite the rules of war. Even today, its ghost whispers across modern battlefields. Sometimes the best armor is not being where the enemy is aiming.